Hello. Welcome to the Bible study on due process for objections, part 2 of submission to lawful authority. This is module 3, session 8 of Living in the Image of God by Banking Blessings Ministry. My name is Goodluck Ofebu.
Hello, I am Tochukwu Chiobi. Welcome to our continuing discussion of interactions between people and lawful authority. Today's discussion will focus on conforming to due process in the event of an objection.
And I am Ijoma Tochiobi. God creates every person to represent Him in interactions with others.
To be for others what God would be for them if He lived with us in human form.
He provides resources to empower every person to perform the responsibilities.
Also, He blesses those that do.
Our program seeks to understand the meaning of living in the image of God, resources that God has provided to guide us, and human responsibilities and benefits of living in the image of God.
Let's dive right in to learn, taste, and share from God's message.
Today's Bible study session is the second of a three-part series on submission to lawful authority.
The three-part study seeks to understand Christ's interactions regarding the temple tax.
We recall that He chose to pay the tax despite recognizing possible grounds for objection.
Our discussion today focuses on understanding that an objection must conform to due process in obedience to lawful authority.
We will discuss examples from interactions among King Saul, his son and second-in-command, Jonathan, and the people of Israel.
The interactions occurred during a military campaign.
The interactions among Saul, Jonathan, and representatives of the people of Israel illustrate due process for objections against lawful authority.
The interactions provide two examples of an objection against an order of the king.
One example did not conform to due process and led to prosecution of the objector.
The other example conformed to due process and resulted in overruling an order of the king.
We will discuss the events to understand the meaning of due process in relation to objections against lawful authority. First, let's discuss an objection by Jonathan.
As second in command, he had initiated a battle against the Philistines.
He was successful in the early stages of the battle and led Israel in pursuit of the enemy through the day.
The soldiers were hungry and faint.
Jonathan ate from honey that was abundant everywhere,
unaware that he disobeyed an order of the king against eating during the pursuit of the Philistine.
After he became aware of the order, he criticized the king publicly for giving such an order.
His objection did not conform to due process,
because his authority did not include disobeying an order of the king or criticizing the king.
As a result, God turned away from Israel.
Let's read from 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 24 to 30 and 37. 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 24. Now the Israelites were in distress that day,
because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying,
Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies.
So none of the troops tasted food.
1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 25. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground.
1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 26. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out.
Yet no one put his hand to his mouth, because they feared the oath.
1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 27. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath.
So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb.
He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened.
1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 28. Then one of the soldiers told him,
Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, Cursed be anyone who eats food today.
That is why the men are faint.
1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 29. Jonathan said, My father has made trouble for the country.
See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey.
1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 30. How much better would it have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies?
Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?
Jonathan disobeyed the king's order, not knowing about the order,
and criticized the king publicly after he was informed of the order.
His actions amounted to disobedience against lawful authority and did not conform to due process.
God turned away from Israel
because Jonathan disobeyed an order of the king and criticized the king publicly.
These actions by Jonathan did not conform to due process, even if they might have been justified.
1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 37. So Saul asked God, Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?
But God did not answer him that day.
The king investigated through prayer and lot and determined that an action by Jonathan was the reason God turned away from Israel.
He announced that Jonathan would be put to death as punishment.
However, representatives of the people selected by the king decided to overrule the king.
Their decision to overrule the king was a collective decision of the people through their duly appointed representatives.
Therefore, their decision conformed to due process, and Jonathan was set free. Let's read from 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 38, 39, and 45.
1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 38. Saul therefore said, Come here, all you who are leaders of the army,
and let us find out what sin has been committed today.
1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 39. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die.
But not one of them said a word.
1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 45. But the men said to Saul,
Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel?
Never, as surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help.
So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death.
That is, the king was overruled by a collective decision of the people through their duly appointed representatives. A collective decision of the people can be accomplished in several ways in a modern-day society, such as the following.
Decision of the legislature.
Decision of the judiciary or court system.
Decisions by specific authorities established by rules and regulations such as tax collectors.
Decisions through referendum or ballot initiatives.
Additionally, a general protest by the people could provide input to a collective decision process. What did we learn in this Bible study?
We discussed the due process for objections against lawful authority.
The discussion is the second in a three-part study
for understanding Christ's submission to the temple tax law despite recognizing possible grounds for objection.
An objection against lawful authority should conform to due process.
We discussed examples from interactions among Saul, Jonathan, and the people of Israel during a military campaign.
In one example, an objection did not conform to due process and resulted in prosecution of the objector.
In another example, an objection by a collective decision of the people resulted in overruling the king,
which illustrates that a collective decision of the people conforms to due process.
There are several forms of collective decision of the people in a modern-day society,
such as a decision of the legislature,
judiciary,
special authority,
referendum or ballot initiative,
or public protest.
Please join us again in our continuing discussion of living in the image of God.
Thank you.
God bless you.